Well, hey there everybody! Welcome back to the Chipmunk channel. I guess that sounds weird. It makes it sound like it's a channel about chipmunks. But it is not. It is a channel about books and movies and the stories they tell and the stories behind them and etc. I haven't really refined my pitch here, but it's something like that. Now, the story I'm talking about today is another in my continuing series on the best-selling books of every year. Now, how do you come up with that criteria? Well, my criteria in particular are simply going off the Publishers Weekly best-selling list of the best-selling books in America by year. And I went with that list because it was the oldest list I could find. I couldn't find any that were official records going back further. So I will have added this video to my playlist. If you go there, you will see all the preceding years going back to 1895. By this point, we are up to, I'm pretty sure it's 1901. I'm starting to lose track. But yes, I believe this is the best-selling book from 1901. And that book is, drum roll please, or whatever you like to increase suspense, The Crisis by Winston Churchill. Not sure if you can see this on camera. So yes, The Crisis by Winston Churchill was the best-selling American book in 1901. This is interesting, personally interesting for one reason. I already had this book on my shelf. I found these books in my high school library back in the day and was like, what? Winston Churchill? And I read them and was like, these are really good. They're really well written. Well, that's the second reason they're interesting, is that it's not that Winston Churchill. This is another Winston Churchill alive at around the same time. What are the odds? This Winston Churchill was a best-selling author in his day. This is not the only one he had on the bestseller list. More about that pretty soon. In fact, I'm just going to launch into talking about the book. Let's go through the life of the author first. Okay, first of all, our author, Winston Churchill, was born in 1871 in St. Louis, Missouri. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, where he became an expert in fencing and organized the first 8-oar rowing crew. He also edited the Army and Navy Journal after graduation, and wound up resigning from the Navy in order to go after his writing career. He was managing editor of Cosmopolitan magazine for 1 year, before resigning that as well, as it was also getting in the way of writing. Most of his novels wound up ranking on the bestseller list almost from the word go. His first work, Mr. Keegan's Elopement, was put out as a magazine serial in the late 1890s, and published in book form in 1903. His second, The Celebrity, did well as a minor bestseller. His third, Richard Carvel, published in 1899, was a much greater success, hitting number 3 on the list for that year, and down to only 8th best for the following year, 1900. His following novels included The Crisis, then The Crossing, Coniston, Mr. Crewe's Career, and The Inside of the Cup, all of which topped various bestseller lists when published. Clearly, sticking with the letter C was for him the way to go. Most of the early ones, such as The Crisis, were historical fiction, all incorporated Churchill's political ideals. There were also play versions of Richard Carvel, The Crisis, The Crossing, and The Uncharted Way, in addition to 3 original plays. In addition to all this, he was an accomplished poet. In 1903 and 1905, Churchill ran successfully for the New Hampshire state legislature, and then he ran for governor in 1906, not so successfully. In 1917, he wrote a non-fiction book on World War I after he took a tour of the battlefields. Also, he took up painting and found some success there, with several of his landscapes hanging in 2 New Hampshire museums, but I cannot show any examples of the artwork because, of course, wouldn't you know it, the more well-known Churchill did this as well, and Google doesn't seem to know the difference. In 1919, our Churchill withdrew from public life and was slowly forgotten. He did publish one more novel in 1940 titled The Uncharted Way, but he didn't care to publicize it much, and it didn't get much notice. It was as early as the 1890s that his works became confused with a certain British writer. Now, at this time, the American was better known, and this little-known British fellow actually corresponded with him with amusement regarding the similarity of their names. It was agreed between the two that the future statesman was to adopt the name Winston Spencer Churchill, or Winston S. Churchill, for his writings. They did arrange to meet a couple of times, but they never became close. Our Churchill died in 1947 in Winter Park, Florida, of a heart attack. The state of New Hampshire recorded his contributions for posterity on their historical road marker number 16. There was a film version of The Crisis in 1916, starring Bessie Ayton, Matt B. Snyder, who was a Civil War veteran, and Tom Sanchi. Pronunciation. Supposedly, there were stunts done by future cowboy star Tom Mix. Timing for the release was fortuitous in that it was an American war film done in the wake of the birth of a nation, but unfortunate due to the fact that World War I came up and put an end to the public's appetite for war films. The film was shot partly on location in Mississippi and St. Louis. It is in the public domain and can be found on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description. Now, my edition of The Crisis is a fairly original edition. It is from 1904. This edition also has signatures of the owners on the front, which I just love that. Apparently at some point it was in Chicago. It says August, I don't know why, December 5th, maybe that's when the person got it. There's Louisa Carpenter, who is probably that person, as everything is in pencil and appears to be the same handwriting. Then, probably later, as it seems to be written above that, is John J. Crincher, something like that. Oh, cursive, how I love you. But anyway, it's always so neat to see some remnant of the original owners. As said, this edition was put out in 1904, the original book being put out in 1901. This edition says it has illustrations by Howard Chandler Christie. However, when you go through the book, there are no illustrations. They haven't been ripped out, they just were never there, so I'm not sure what happened. Here are a few of the examples of what those illustrations actually look like that are apparently in other copies, but not mine. And there is a dedication to JBG and LMG, not sure who they are, more mystery. And this is why I love getting old copies of books, because partway through the book I came across another mystery. Somebody had clipped a newspaper article and folded it in the pages and forgotten about it. It is regarding the death of a, as it says, prominent club woman named Mrs. Harriet Virginia Conlog Maloney, age 51, who died in Indiana. So no clue as to why this is in here and why the person who clipped it found it so important to clip it and keep it. Now, as to the story, this book is interesting, as it is a work of historical fiction written about the Civil War, so naturally the issues of slavery and the issues of war play very big parts, and the author has a few things to say on the subject. The story has some interesting moments that seem very relatable to issues our country is facing at the present time. Now, the thing about the story is that it isn't intending to be that way, I don't think, but viewed through a modern lens, it is told in a racist manner. This is a white man telling a story that involves black people who at the time and in that location would have been greatly uneducated, and so that affects the way that he is relating their story. Some of these people are servants, some of them are slaves. Let me just give you a quick rundown of the plot. We are in St. Louis, Missouri, which is kind of it's a slave area, but it's kind of halfway. There's a great many people for, there's a great many people against. The governor of Missouri himself is pro-slave, but not everybody who lives in the state is pro-slave, so this is pre-war, and nobody's exactly sure what's going to happen or how it's going to go. We focus on Stephen Bryce, our hero. He is from Boston, and he and his mother have fallen on hard times and come down to St. Louis to live. Stephen goes to work for a judge, Judge Whipple, who is a very pro-abolitionist. Stephen is trying to become a lawyer through his work for the judge. When he's there, he encounters a slave market and it just cuts him to the quick. He sees families being torn apart, and it is very rough. He sees two sisters who will be sold separately, more than likely. Their mother is already freed, and she is in the audience, but she's crying. She can't afford to buy her daughters. So even though it's up to Stephen to take care of his mother and himself for the next so many years on his savings, he can't let this go because he's a good guy. So he puts forth the last of his savings and buys the one daughter that the mother cannot afford to buy. He then presents her with her freedom, and the two actually end up working as servants for himself and his mother, more out of gratitude than anything. Now, also in the audience at the auction is Miss Virginia Carvel. If that last name is familiar, that is because she is the descendant of Richard Carvel, the titular hero of one of Churchill's prior books. So this is a descendant. It's very interesting the way he continued that, a sequel of sorts. She is a true blue Southerner, and her dad, the Colonel, is a slave owner. Now, it's one of those interesting things, particularly of the time, that he is depicted as a kind slave owner. Awkward, I know. It's even mentioned that he is much kinder to his slaves than many others would be. However, he cannot shake his firmly rooted idea, the biblical thing that so many people of the time fell back on, saying, no, it's in the Bible that, the sons of Ham were supposed to be servants to the son of Japheth or whatever, and how they came upon the idea that black people were the sons of Ham and white people I have no idea. Convenience, I guess. In any case, that is the Colonel's idea, and he cannot be shaken from that. Even though, other than that, he is depicted as being a very good man and very fair in many ways, and he and the judge are actually friends and have many friendly arguments over the issue. However, as war burgeons more and more, the two of them are driven apart by their ideals. Being a historical novel, the judge has connections, and he puts Stephen in touch with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln winds up being a character in the book, which is also very interesting. I don't know much. I haven't read biographies or anything like that. I don't know too much about Lincoln. I remember watching the Spielberg film and thinking, oh, he's a little corny, he's a little down home and always telling stories. Well, maybe that's the way Lincoln was, because that's exactly the way he is depicted in this book. I don't know if they took some stuff from this book for the movie, perhaps, or maybe that is just the way Lincoln is shown to be. Devotees of Lincoln biographies would know more than I. In any case, wouldn't you know, Romeo and Juliet, two sides, north and south. Stephen and Virginia wind up falling in love, although they vigorously try to push against this and deny this fact throughout the entire book. With the backdrop of the war, and it shows the hardships that they both go through, that everyone around them goes through. Until finally, at the end, the South has fallen, and the two of them do put aside their differences and reconcile their love. What I found very interesting in this book is that there are two major characters who straddle both sides of the line. The first is Mr. Eliphalet Hopper. If I'm pronouncing that right, it's a very odd name. We actually start the book finding out about Mr. Eliphalet, it's quite a name, Hopper. He is also a northerner who comes south and encounters the slave market, etc. He winds up working for the colonel. However, Mr. Hopper is quite different to Mr. Bryce in that he is an opportunist. And throughout the war, he ends up doing whatever is necessary to make money and build himself up. So, more or less, he's kind of a villain of the piece because nobody likes him. Not the Northerners, not the Southerners, pretty much anyone who encounters just is like, this is a slimy dude. Counter to that, we have Mr. Brinsmaid, who is a first neighbor to the Bryces, and then they end up moving into his house. He is an extremely kind and thoughtful person who is the sort who's constantly going out to help neighbors, and he continues this through the war. He ends up beginning and heading the Sanitary Commission, whose function it is to keep things running, such as making sure people get water that they can drink and use, making sure they have clothing, getting hospitals up and running and keeping them going. And he will do that regardless of who he is tending to. He's the sort of person who just wants to take care of people, and his neighbors especially. So yes, I find this novel quite interesting because it does come down on one side, and it has a very definite viewpoint. However, it's fair in certain ways. It presents the other side as people who are not just representative of their one opinion. They are complicated as humans are. And I personally believe that if we take any lesson from this book, then that would be it. Our first selection, a depiction of the slave market. Against the walls and pillars of the building, already grimy with soot, crouched a score of miserable human beings waiting to be sold at auction. Mr. Lynch's slave pen had been disgorged that morning. Old and young, husband and wife, the moment was come for all and each. How hard the stones, and what more pitiless than the gaze of their fellow creatures in the crowd below? O friends, we who live in peace and plenty amongst our families, how little do we realize the terror and the misery and the dumb heartaches of those days. Stephen thought with agony of seeing his own mother sold before his eyes, and the building in front of him was lifted from its foundation and rocked even as shall the temples on the judgment day. He was silent. From that peaceful little room, war and its horrors seemed very far away. The morning sun poured in through the south windows and was scattered by the silver on the sideboard. From above on the wall, Colonel Wilton Bryce gazed soberly down. Stephen's eyes lighted on the portrait, and his thoughts flew back to the boyhood days when he used to ply his father with questions about it. Then the picture had suggested only the glory and honor which illumines the page of history, something worthy to look back upon, to keep one's head high. The hatred and the suffering and the tears, the heart-rending, tearing apart for all time of loving ones who have grown together, these were not upon that canvas. Will war ever be painted with wart? Is war a thing to stir the blood? Aye, while the day lasts. But what of the long nights when husband and wife have lain side by side? What of the children who ask piteously where their father is going, and who are gathered by a sobbing mother to her breast? Where is the picture of that last breakfast at home? So, in the midst of the cheer which is saddest in life, comes the thought that, just 1 year ago, he who is the staff of the house was wont to sit down just so merrily to his morning meal before going to work in the office. Why had they not thanked God on their knees for peace while they had it? One of those selections which I think is
similar to things we have experienced recently. Sunday dawned, and the people flocked to the churches, but even in the house of God were dissension and strife. From the Carvel pew at Dr. Postlethwaite's, Virginia saw men and women rise from their knees and walk out, their faces pale with anger. At St. Mark's, the prayer for the President of the United States was omitted. Mr. Russell and Mr. Catherwood nodded approvingly over the sermon in which the South was justified, and the sanction of Holy Writ laid upon her institution. With not indifferent elation, these gentlemen watched the departure of brethren with whom they had labored for many years, save only when Mr. Brinsmaid walked down the aisle never to return. So it is that war, like a devastating flood, creeps insistent into the most sacred places and will not be denied. At this point, the war is done. The next day, the day our sundered nation was born, Vicksburg surrendered. The obstinate man with the mighty force had conquered. See the gray regiments marching silently in the tropic heat into the folds of that blue army whose grip has choked them at last. Silently, too, the blue coats stand, pity and admiration on the brick-red faces. The arms are stacked and surrendered. Officers and men are to be paroled when the counting is finished. The formations melt away, and those who for months have sought each other's lives are grouped in friendly talk. The coarse army bread is drawn eagerly from the knapsacks of the blue. Smoke quivers above 100 fires, and the smell of frying bacon brings a wistful look into the gaunt faces. Tears stand in the eyes of many a man as he eats the food his Yankee brothers have given him on the birthday of their country. These are the closing words of the book, the closing words of the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln, and it seems quite fitting to the book and again to events currently. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his children, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
So, okay, there we have it. A lot about this book. Interesting stuff about the author, first of all, I thought. And second of all, an interesting look into a certain period in our nation's history, a bit of which can be related to events today, which, makes it doubly, interesting. I use that word a lot, I know I do, but just so many things are that interesting. I'll use another word as soon as I can come up with one. So hey, that'll give me a project for the next week or so. Come up with other words than interesting. Until then, I hope you have a good week. Take care of yourselves and each other. Read more books. Watch more movies. Give me more recommendations down in the comments. I'd love to see what you recommend. And I'm going to do a video or 2 or 3 or whatever in the future about your recommendations. So I will see you next week, no matter what. Bye!